I'm not an art historian, but I don't feel out of place at all because there have been lots of people who aren't art historians. I feel somewhat out of place in that I'm not really talking about art at all. But I think I am talking about maybe an issue or a theoretical question that relates to any kind of comparative work of the kind that we're engaged in today. Thanks to Zira for the invitation. We've been sort of partners in crime for a long time, discussing these issues. And I'm drawing on work that I've been doing this year on the actor Richard Burton. November the 10th will be the centenary of Richard Burton's birth. And much of my work in the last year has been revolving around him. And there's this film, The Rains of Ranchipur, which I'm going to use as a hinge. Anyone coming to a conference, perhaps with the theme of colonialism being central to it, would expect me to be discussing this Richard Burton. So I'll start by saying that I'm not talking about him. Born in Torquay, Devon in 1821, this Richard Burton joined the Bombay Army as an officer in 1842 and became known for his travels and explorations in Asia, Africa, and South America. And that's his book on Sind and the races that inhabit the valley of the Indus, with notices of the topography and history of the province. So that's a Richard Burton, who's perhaps in some ways elements of his period, if not him himself, will overshadow some of what I have to say, in that I am engaged in the question of colonial discourse and its aftermath. But I'm talking about this Richard Burton, born in Pont Rhydyfen, as some of you will know, I'm sure, in Cwmavan in 1925, and who was, by the 1960s, arguably the most famous Welshman in the world, even if most of my students today haven't heard of him. They've heard of Elizabeth Taylor generally, so we trace Richard Burton back from that. The Rains of Ranchipur flopped at the box office. I describe it as Richard Burton's third worst film. I won't tell you what the others are. In December of 1955, in the same year as that film, Burton played Henry V at Stratford to rave reviews, which made up for the stinking reviews given to The Rains of Ranchipur even at the time. Kenneth Tynan, fast becoming the arbiter of theatrical reputations, noted that Burton was becoming the natural successor of Olivier. So the film appears at the key time in Burton's career. Tynan says he is a pure anti-romantic, ingrowing rather than outgrowing. Within this actor, there is always something reserved, a rooted solitude, which his Welsh blood tinges with mystery. You could argue the opposite, right? That is outgrowing and not ingrowing. It seems to me that that kind of phrase resonates with quite a lot of what we've been listening to today. The images, Turner's images of Wales, dark, ingrowing, whereas India seemed open to the colonial gaze in a way that Wales was not. And just that language of blood and of tinges is already deploying a colonial discourse to describe Burton. Such descriptions were often used to describe Burton in the 1950s. And it's striking, actually, how often he played the roles of racial others, sometimes in blackface. Here he is on the left as Othello, and then as Caliban in The Tempest. Images that, to some extent, might then resonate with him playing the role of Dr. Safti in The Rains of Ranchipur. In this film, Burton is the innocent, mournful outsider in a world of colonial opulence. Lena Turner is Edwina Esgith, unhappily married to Lord Esgith, in India to purchase a stallion for her stables from the Maharani. The animal she selects, of course, is Richard Burton, or Dr. Safti. When the rains of the title eventually come, they come in torrents. There are earthquakes, dam bursts, floods ensue, It's all pretty apocalyptic, suggesting, I think, that this is the result of an illicit relationship across what was known as the colour line. The basic tropes of desire, pursuit, racial otherness, and attraction are then present in the Rains of Ranchipur, and they set up, in a sense, I think, what happens to Burton as the 50s turn into the 60s, because they return as themes a few years later in the film Cleopatra and the scandal of the adulterous relationship between Burton and Elizabeth Taylor that took place on that film's set. A few other images from the Rains of Ranchipur here. Burton playing an Indian role. If you've watched the film, he doesn't make any attempt to change his accent at all. Clearly, a Welsh accent is equivalent to an Indian accent, which again is a trope actually that reappears occasionally in the literature. Okay, let's move on. I've been editing Burton's writings, and he's actually a very fine writer. He deploys a kind of colonial discourse himself, not least when he first encounters Elizabeth Taylor, or at least his telling of it. In this little booklet called Meeting Miss Jenkins, Richard Burton, as you probably know, was born Richard Jenkins in Pontrydyfen. He adopts the name of Philip Burton, his teacher. I'll come back to him later. So Mrs. Jenkins is Mrs. Burton in a sense. I'll read this. I'm not endorsing this view of either femininity or relationships, right? It was my first time in California and my first visit to a swank house. There were quite a lot of people in and around the pool, all suntanned and all drinking the Sunday morning liveners, Bloody Marys, Boilermakers, highballs, iced beers. I knew some of the people and was introduced to others. Wet brown arms reached out of the pool and shook my hand. A girl sitting on the other side of the pool lowered her book, took off her sunglasses and looked at me. She was so extraordinarily beautiful that I nearly laughed out loud. She is older than the deck chair in which she sits, I thought headily, and she is famine, fire, destruction, and plague. She is the dark lady of the sonnets, the only true begetter. Her breasts were apocalyptic. They would topple empires down before they withered. Indeed, her body was a miracle of construction and the work of an engineer of genius. It needed nothing except itself. It was true art, I thought, executed in terms of itself. She was lavish, she was dark, unyielding largesse. She was, in short, too bloody much, and not only that, she was totally ignoring me. I became frustrated almost to screaming when I had finished a well-received and humorous story about the death of my grandfather and found that she was turned away in deep conversation with another woman. So what strikes me here are the imperial metaphors. Taylor, like a nation to be conquered in a colonial travel narrative, echoes here of that other Richard Burton, is dark, unyielding, lavish. And as is often the case when Burton becomes inarticulate, he almost resorts to screaming. Burton's imperial desire for Taylor, expressed in a metaphor-laden Orientalist discourse, casts him as a conqueror, intoxicated by the exotic. But there's also some unease here. The house is swank, suggesting that he's familiar with more modest abodes. And this is his first time in California, in this world of brown arms and sun-tanned bodies. Only famine, fire, destruction, and plague can result from this encounter with Taylor, as her apocalyptic breasts would topple empires. So this resonates, right, with some of the imagery, the genderization of empire and the nation. The language of the passage reminds us that Burton fell in love with Taylor on the film set of Cleopatra. Taylor was in the third year of marriage to her third husband, the singer Eddie Fisher at the time. Burton, as his allusions to death and destruction suggest, and again, this resonates with the Rains of Ranchipur in a sense where love leads to death and destruction. Burton was racked with guilt as his relationship with Taylor led to divorce on grounds I quote from the legal case of the cruel and inhumane treatment of his wife Sybil and their two daughters, Kate and Jessica. The Taylor-Burton romance, as it plays out on the set of Cleopatra, and as it represented in the film, really, can be considered a symbolic balm for a white public reeling from the loss of imperial dominance. This is the early 1960s, with Elizabeth Taylor's reconfiguring as a white other coinciding with the successful consummation of several anti-colonial independence movements in the 50s and 60s. And in the Rains of Ranchipur, Burton had himself played a colonised other, with the devastation wrought on the Indian landscape in that mid-50s film, perhaps a symbolic punishment or revenge for the nation's gaining its independence. So there's an imperial background, I think, to Burton's career, and it's embodied in some of his writings. There's also a racial liminality about the Burtons, the roles that they play. And this can be explored further. This takes us further afield, but it's on the same theme of the construction of whiteness in their relationship with, well, actually, I've jumped this. There's a relationship with Sammy Davis Jr. and his wife, Mae Britt. And you see this cover of photoplay where the wives are swapped. So, there's a suggestion of wife swapping and miscegenation going on in the popular culture. But I want to go on to the relationship between Burton and the author James Baldwin. Baldwin, as many of you will know, I hope, an African-American, openly queer writer. Baldwin first appears in the Richard Burton diaries on Easter Sunday, 1969. Burton and Elizabeth Taylor are at their house in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. And this is the quote: "As we arrived back at the house, we were hailed by a Negro. It turned out to be James Baldwin and a French boy who spoke no English. He was down here escaping from Hollywood," he said. "We discussed Black Power, Black Panthers, Black is best, Black is beautiful, and Black and White. He said quite openly, and not at all sneakily, 'Richard, can you let me have $20? Let me have, mark you, not lend.'" The request for money suggests prior acquaintance, though that's not clear. Baldwin's most recent substantial publication at the time was the novel Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone. The novel centers on an actor, in this case a bisexual African-American named Leo Proudhammer. Proudhammer's life has been clouded by a drunk father, and like Richard Burton, the actor is openly disdainful of his occupation. Burton's claim that "I've never been much interested in the so-called craft or art of acting" is mirrored in Proudhammer's declaration that acting is, I quote, "like jerking off," and in the unspeakable shame and fury he feels concerning his career. More significantly, in relation to Burton, Leo Proudhammer gets his first break playing the role of Morgan Evans in a revised version of Emlyn Williams's play, The Corn is Green. An unlikely scene in Burton's novel, but it's there. Burton lists Emlyn Williams as his third major influence after Meredith Jones and Philip Burton, for giving the fledgling actor, I quote, "my first part on the stage and on screen." Indeed, Burton made his first professional appearance in Emlyn Williams's The Druid Rest, his first film appearance in Williams's The Last Days of Dolwyn, the story of the drowning of a Welsh village to create a reservoir to supply water to Liverpool, written and directed by Emlyn Williams. And Burton also played the minor Morgan Evans in both the radio and television productions of The Corn is Green in 1945 and 1946, respectively. That radio, television, and major film versions of the play were released within a 2-year period testifies to the popularity of this reworking, really, of the Pygmalion story. Those of you familiar with Shaw's play, where Eliza Doolittle, the Cockney, is taught to speak English properly. It becomes the musical My Fair Lady, right? Corn is Green is essentially the same story. The role played by Philip Burton in Richard Jenkins's life had been played a generation earlier by Sarah Cook, who secured a place in Oxford for Emlyn Williams, and inspired both his literary career and his most famous autobiographical play. Towards the end of James Baldwin's novel, Proudhammer offers a lengthy recollection of the preparation, rehearsal, and performance of this experimental version of The Corn is Green, in which Bessie, Mrs. Watty, all the mine boys, and old Tom are black people. Ray Fisher, a friend of the director, persuades Leo to take on the role by noting, and I thought I had this, but I haven't, so you'll have to listen to this one. So this is a quotation from Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone. One of the things that's most impressed me in this country is the struggle of black people to get an education. I always think it's one of the great stories and nobody knows anything about it. If there were a play on that subject, I'd probably do that, but I don't know of any, so I thought I'd try this experiment with this play. I think you'll see what I mean when you read it. I certainly hope you do. Very few of the elements in the play are really alien to American life. I thought I'd take this play, this mining town situation, with no comment, so to say, only making the miners and servants, people like that, black. It's true that the play takes place in Wales, but I think we can make the audience forget that after the first few minutes. And hell, anyway, there are black people in Wales. And I figured we'd let the Negro kids improvise around the stretches of Welsh dialogue. Dialect, really. And of course, we've got tremendous musical opportunities with this play. So the struggle to get an education transcends ethnic difference, and Baldwin, in the voice of Ray, is opening possible, if problematic, areas of correspondence between Welsh and African American histories. Despite the unquestionable differences in the nature and degree of oppression faced by each group, both sought in their different ways, particularly in the latter decades of the 19th century, to reconstruct their identities in the face of debasing stereotypes. I'm picking up on aspects of Peter Lord's paper here. Kevin Gaines's description of the ideology of uplift in Victorian African America, as I quote, the exaltation of domestic virtue, symbolized by home, family, chastity, and respectability, all infused with an ethic of religious piety, could have been lifted from Hywel Tavy Edwards's Codi'r Hen Wlad yn ei Hôl, and indeed resonates to some extent with the image of Salem. Yet it's the limits in some ways of this ideology for African Americans that strikes us in Baldwin's account of The Corn is Green. Baldwin's novel encourages us inadvertently to consider Richard Burton's location within the racial debates of the 1960s. We've heard already about the blue books, and dominant forms of Welshness in the 19th century. I'm picking back up, I think, on the thread of the conference after an American diversion. Dominant forms of Welshness in the 19th century were constructed in relation to an imperial discourse of blackness. The infamous government report on the state of education in Wales, Brad y Llyfrau Gleision, the treason of the Blue Books, characterised the Welsh language as the language of slavery that kept the Welsh people under the hatches as though on a slave ship. The Welsh were depicted as living in an underworld of their own, through which the march of society goes completely over their head. Linguistic deviation from Anglophone norms was framed in terms of slavery, and within this linguistic underworld, the undoubted promiscuity of Welsh women was encouraged by the way in which nonconformist sects met in small, intimate groups outside the boundaries of the Anglican Church. Gwyneth Tyson Roberts documents in some detail the discursive similarities between the Blue Books and Thomas Babington Macaulay's Minute on Indian Education and Sir Charles Wood's Despatch on Indian Education. And more broadly, she reads the Blue Books as part of the same Victorian imperial language about improving and anglicising subject peoples that appears in those Indian policies. In response to these attacks, significant sectors of the Victorian Welsh bourgeoisie sought to demonstrate their whiteness and respectability, remodeling themselves and their communities as practical, business-like, English-speaking Britons. Indeed, I'd argue that Gwyn, white, became a keyword in the Welsh ideology of social uplift. Cymru lan, Cymru lonydd, Cymru wen, Cymru annwyl beunydd. The claim is often made that the wen as deployed in Welsh does not carry any racial connotations. This is the late 19th century. I mean, it might not have in the biblical Gwyn Fyddai, but by now I think it did and does. Indeed, Gwyn white became a keyword in the Welsh ideology of social uplift. In the United States, a similar process occurred in what Noel Ignatieff described as the story of how the Irish became white. That's Ignatieff's book on the slide. And on mainland Europe, in the transformation following Eugene Weber's formulation of Breton peasants into Frenchmen. So, there's a pattern, right, of trying to throw away that which makes you ethnically different in a process of assimilation. And the late 19th century is probably the high point of this. It's captured in the images, I think, of Queen Victoria that we saw as well. The education that Richard Burton, the actor, received at the feet of his teacher, Philip Burton, in Port Talbot, was, I think, an embodiment of this Victorian assimilationist impulse, carried well into the 20th century. I mean, one of the problems with the film Mr. Burton that came out this year is that it seems to fully endorse that narrative and even support it. This is a narrative that underpinned the imperial values of Britain. To move up in society involved a process of Anglicization, which some historians argue reflected the democratic will of the people. Such an argument seems to ignore the ways in which the predominant public and commercial aspects of life were firmly reinforcing British and Anglophone norms. But the Welsh experience was not unique. The process of social uplift for poor whites often entailed a kind of racial decontamination. Having had their distinctive ethnic practices, language, religion, faith, and so forth, historically associated with or symbolized in relation to blackness within Victorian discourses of class and empire, progress for these white minorities was measured by their increasing distance from those particularities. What the African-American man of letters W.E.B. Du Bois termed the wages of whiteness made assimilation possible for white ethnic groups. This was not an option available for the vast majority of their African-American contemporaries, neither for many of the colonized peoples who were sort of invited to uplift, but found barriers to that potential. Walter Ben Michaels argues that the ascent of white ethnics up the social hierarchy in the United States was less an effect of the triumph over racism than an effect of the triumph of racism. And I think much the same can be said about imperial Britain. That is, in climbing up the ladder, some groups could become white. What happened then was the binary black-white becomes established because some groups cannot ascend up that hierarchical ladder. So that's part of the context of the construction of whiteness, right? And I don't think it's limited to the United States, in fact. But a shift then happens in the 1960s, reflected in Peter's, the radical redeployment of the Welsh dress that Peter Lord discussed, with the dismantling of European empires. After the Second World War, several minority nationalisms in Europe and anti-assimilationist white subcultures in the United States reversed this assimilationist trajectory into whiteness to pursue a different path that sought to differentiate themselves and their people from dominant norms. As separatist nationalisms gained traction on the peripheries of the French and British states, and as various American subcultures began to critique the ideology of uplift underlying American assimilationism, white minorities, within the context of the civil rights movement and Black Power, began to reappropriate the Black otherness that they'd been so desperate to shed a generation earlier. The claim that Wales is a colonized nation, like India, shares the logic of this embrace of a previously rejected otherness. I'm just checking my time. Did we say 1:45 I was supposed to finish? Okay. I'll stick to it, I promise. I'm over already. So let me just, I'm on the last page. But this is the context for Richard Burton's repeated claim to a kind of minoritarian status in the 60s. He's in America at the time when hyphenated Americans are emerging. In a famous interview with Playboy of 1963, he says, "It's difficult for somebody who comes from a majority to know quite what it's like to be in a minority, to be a Jew or a Welshman or an Irishman. What it does to a Negro, I shudder to imagine." Throughout his essays in the 60s, he's making these kinds of points. It's difficult for someone who comes from a majority to know what it's like to be in a minority. But nevertheless, there's a limit to his sympathy, and the passage on Baldwin results in him actually accusing Baldwin of stealing money from him. And the second quotation here is from his diaries, where Baldwin has written to him asking how does he pay him back. Now, what does he mean when he says that he doesn't hold a bank account in California? I mean, any old bank account will do. It's Baldwin's excuse, I think, that he can't pay Burton the money back. Nova Scotia, National Provincial, the Federal Bank of Dahomey, Calabria, the Chase Manhattan, or a postal order. Funny chap. We all, as I've said before, owe him a living because he is black and we are white. Off-white. That we owe him a living expresses a kind of white guilt at past atrocities, but Burton checks that white by qualifying it. The qualifying off is reinforced by his humorous deployment of the longest place in the British Isles, common on Victorian postcards, as we saw with Peter Lord. The off-white allows a kind of conception of colonial mimicry, right? We've heard from Homi Bhabha already. Burton is locating himself as almost the same, but not quite, a performance of sameness that inevitably reveals difference and therefore destabilizes colonial authority. But here, mimicry is adopted by a white subject, as is the case of Taylor's Cleopatra or Burton's Dr. Safti. His own description as off-white comes from a position of privilege. It serves not so much to subvert dominance as to reinforce it. So a final point on this, as volumes like Ignatiev's How the Irish Became White point out, there's a troubling kind of paradox, because in disaffiliating from whiteness, reclaiming pre-white ethnic identities, what is often happening is that we're reproducing the very structures of the discourse that we're aiming to critique. What happens in this overinvestment in a historical past is that whiteness becomes re-privileged. In America, Burton and Taylor perform a kind of fantasy of white renewal during the era described by Cornel West as the end of the age of Europe. In this context, whether framed through the historical injury of Burton's working class past or the Orientalist spectacle of Taylor's Cleopatra, the return to an ethnic difference that predated assimilation functions less to destabilize whiteness than to reassert whiteness, placing it back at the center and testifying to its adaptive power. Diolch yn fawr.